Hello, everyone. I'm Jenna Paone with A Mighty Blaze, and today I'm so excited to welcome the fabulous Beatriz Williams with me today. Hello, Beatriz. How are you?
Such a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yes, thank you for being here. We are here to celebrate the release of Beatriz's latest book, Her Last Flight, which is a
I got a
stunning,
copy.
grippy tale. Oh, yes. Do we have your
Yes.
copy? I just realized my copy's
It's
not by me. Yes.
handy next to the computer now.
I love it. It's so gorgeous, and we're so thrilled. We always know, fans of Beatrice like me always know we can look forward to just a sensational release from you.
Aw,
And
thank you.
it's a highlight of my year whenever your book comes out. I always want to say summer, but sometimes your books come out at other times as well. So
Sometimes I sneak an extra one in there during the
sneak
winter.
those extra ones because you're not doing enough, and we're going to talk about that because you are a woman of many talents and write in a variety of different format like ways. You write solo, you write with Lauren Willig and Karen White, you write as Juliana Gray. We are going to talk about all of that, but first I'm going to give a little intro, and this is the embarrassing part where I read your accolades for like 20 minutes and you just sit there awkwardly and kind of laugh and
Like,
smile.
yeah, I know. Yeah, the male authors are like, yes, yes. And you also mentioned the time that,
Yeah, they're like, oh, you forgot that article that I wrote. No. Just kidding, guys. We love you too.
we love you guys. We do. And so do you.
Today is about Beatriz Williams. And Beatriz Williams is the New York Times, USA Today, and internationally best-selling author of The Golden Hour, The Summer Wives, The Secret Life of Violet Grant, 100 Summers, and several other works of historical fiction, including her latest, Her Last Flight. A graduate of Stanford University with an MBA in finance from Columbia, Beatrice worked as a communications and corporate strategy consultant in New York and London before she turned her attention to writing novels that combine her passion for history with an obsessive devotion to voice and characterization. Beatrice's books have won numerous awards, have been translated into more than a dozen languages, and appear regularly in bestseller lists around the world. Born in Seattle, Washington, Beatrice now lives near the Connecticut shore with her husband and 4 children, where she divides her time between writing and laundry, and maybe a little more laundry these days because of
Oh
the
my God.
the
And now the
pandemic,
cooking, just
which
keeping
we'll
everybody
get to.
in bed
Ugh,
is a full-time job. I
it's
am.
too much. We're going to talk about it. We're going to talk about it all. So Beatrice's most recent release, Her Last Flight, which Goodreads, She Reads, and Bookish have all dubbed one of summer's most anticipated reads, is a sweeping and suspenseful tale about a lost pilot and a wartime photographer. With star-crossed romance, gravity-defying twists and turns, a vivid array of dreamy settings, and Beatrice's signature lyrical language, Her Last Flight is a triumphant and epic journey.
Thank you.
Welcome, Beatrice.
That's
Thank you
lovely.
so much
It's so
for
good
being.
to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, we're so thrilled. Thank you for being here. I am just I'm such a huge fan of yours. I was gushing over you in the private room before we went live. But I really am a genuine fan of yours who has read all of your books and is pretty obsessed with you. But first of all, let's start by talking about Her Last Flight, because that's what we're here celebrating. And for those readers
Yes.
who haven't read it yet, can you just give us sort of the elevator pitch, the short, brief summation of what happens in this fabulous book?
Yes, it's a bit hard to boil down to and I'm bad at elevator pitches anyway, but I'll just kind of go with the basic sort of jacket copy, which is, it is a book that is very loosely inspired by Amelia Earhart's story, in which in 1937, a pilot, the most famous woman in the world, disappears on a round the world flight over the Sahara Desert. And in 1947, a woman who is a photojournalist has just finished covering the battlefields of World War II, arrives in a remote surfing village in Hawaii, and tracks down a woman she believes to be the vanished pilot. And together they find out more and more about each other and discover the common ground that they share.
Fabulous. I love it. And there's so many twists and turns in this. There's so many surprises. I'm not going to spoil any of them while we talk because it's such a delight. And that's actually also kind of a hallmark of your work, that there's always this crazy twist at the end that you're like, whoa, I did not see that coming. And
The funny thing is, it's not like I go into each book like, okay, what's the twist? It tends to evolve naturally because I'm not quite sure how I'm going to wrap it up. And that's kind of how it happens. Although certainly there's like a key twist in her last flight that I knew going in, which is actually fairly unusual for me. But again, it's not like I go in there being like, okay, what is my twist for this book? I'm not sort of trying to make it twisty. I'm just trying to keep the reader's interest, as we go along. And
well,
it's just
you're
kind of that.
excellent at crafting like mysteries, like they're like nobody, I think people don't necessarily think of your books necessarily as mysteries, but there's always a mystery. There's always a layer that somebody's trying to uncover. There's a secret from history that somebody's trying to uncover. And that's part of why they're so great. They're also, on a broader level, you are an incredibly structural writer. Your books are very tightly structured.
Very, yeah.
You have, so I'm interested when you say you don't always know where you're going. Do you start from an outline, or do you just dive in? Do you enter through character, through setting? How do you approach it? What's your jumping
I
off
used to be like, oh, definitely this, but as I've written more books, and inspiration has come from different places. So I don't necessarily always start in the same place with the same amount of, sort of foregone conclusions as I start the book. I don't do a detailed outline except when I'm writing with Karen and Lauren, and then we actually do put together very, very detailed chapter by chapter outlines. But with my own books, it's really depends on the starting point, what has sort of inspired me to write the book. But I usually have the setting, the characters, and a general idea of what this character's arc is going to be.
Yep.
And maybe I'll just take Her Last Flight as an example. I was loosely inspired by Amelia Earhart, and that's partly because I love aviation. I've always been fascinated by it. You talk about my books being structured, and my father's an engineer, and I never thought of myself as being a mathy person. Particularly, I've always been drawn much more to sort of literature, but I do have a lot. I kind of got like even scores, like math and verbal SAT. So I think there is some stuff in there. Like I can figure out how to fix stuff, I just sort of, so I think it's really helped me. And I do kind of think of my plots as this sort of, I don't do a lot of written outlines, but I kind of keep it in my head as like a 3-dimensional model, like a house that I'm building. And, and so I kind of know the foundation, I know the general structure, but it's sort of like room by room, how am I gonna, create this thing into, a warm, welcoming residence, to just like stretch that metaphor as far as it can go. So, with the case of Her Last Flight, fascinated by aviation, particularly by the mystery of Amelia Earhart. I think, I probably read an article, I'm kind of like stretching my brain back to the very, very beginning. Read an article about a jar of freckle cream or something that had been found on, one of these remote Pacific islands, and people are like, oh, maybe she survived here with her. By the way, her co-pilot, there was a co-pilot, the navigator, Fred Noonan, was in there too. Poor old Fred, nobody ever cares what happened to him, but he probably would have survived with her on this, on this island. And that kind of got me thinking, well, what if this, what if that? And then it kind of went from there. And once I got the research going, so it was really for me the challenge, and I always sort of write, so there's generally 2 narratives. Sometimes I add a third, like there's like a key character, and I kind of dot in sort of like the, like the accent color in a room. I kind of dot that in a little bit. But there's generally 2 main narratives. One is the thing that takes place in the past, that is the mystery, that the second narrative is out to solve.
Yes, the person.
And in the case, so I always write that first mystery narrative first from beginning to end. I do not write the way that you see it on the page, because I need to know what happened in the past so that I can structure that second narrative around it. I need to have lived that entire period in the past, or at least get to the point where I kind of know what happens. I haven't choreographed how that actually works out, but I know what the result's going to be. and then I write the second narrative. So in the case of Her Last Flight, the primary narrative is the story of Irene Foster, who is my pilot, loosely inspired by Amelia Earhart. It is told, this is kind of, I thought I'd kind of try something new narratively. It is actually told as excerpts from a biography written by Janie Everett, who is my, my photojournalist in the 1947 narrative. So we always have to remember that it's Janie telling the story. And yet this was the first one I wrote. So not only do I have to figure out who Irene is, I have to figure out who is this woman who is telling her story. So I'm figuring out these two characters as we went along. And I kind of loosely, I had certain points that I knew, certain scenes that were going to take place. But I ended up rewriting those first, say 100 pages or so of the story over and over again, because I just, I could not figure out exactly how the story went along. I knew what the arc was, but I just couldn't figure out what were those sections of arc, that went in there, until finally, I kind of had to free myself from Amelia a little bit. I had to say, this is not an Amelia biography. This is, I will take certain parts of her life that interest me the most and weave that into this. But once I kind of set myself free from that, then I was like, okay, now I can write this plot without having to feel bound to all these elements of Amelia's life. So, that was kind of the challenge in this one. But again, it was knowing what that arc was going to be. And then once I sat down to write Janie's part, that just flowed. I wrote that in a matter of weeks, partly because I already knew her so well, because she'd been telling Irene's story, but partly because she was just so compelling to me. I just loved this woman so much. And yet she's not what you would call a likable character. Certainly in the beginning, she's very hard, but once the layers start, she slowly unpeels her layers, and you start to realize just how much trauma this woman has undergone in her life. And I just loved her so much. Plus just the way she does not trust her audience at first. She's not going to tell you stuff because she doesn't trust you. And slowly that relationship between the reader and the storyteller develops a little more trust. And finally, she lets you know things, very deep personal things about herself. But, it was just, in terms of just the storytelling process, for me, it just felt like such a breakthrough with Janie. It was one of the few books, and I would maybe say Along the Infinite Sea, the only other one where I finished the book feeling like I had truly undergone as close to immaculate an emotional journey as I had ever written. I just felt at the end like the resolution of this character's emotional, emotional journey was really very full and complete and satisfying. And so I just love this book so much. It's sort of like everything going on. I have this book. I was so excited to bring this book out, and here we are. And my little book is like the least important thing in the world right now with everything going on. I'm just like,
but you know what? Books are important because, and I would actually argue that they're more important now. The whole reason we started The Blaze was because we wanted to shine some light during these dark times. And that's what great books do, and great pieces of art. They transport us. And quite frankly, none of us are really living in a time that we that is super enjoyable, it's a very interesting time, and it's challenging us all in probably a lot of good ways, in some good ways. There's also a great deal of tragedy. There's a great deal of difficulty and stress and suffering going on in the world right now on a number of fronts, not just with the pandemic, but with everything we're undergoing as a country, with our racial reckoning and our gender reckonings and everything like that, which is necessary. But books really, they really transport us, and they really are important. So thank you. Don't ever think it's not important. And I want to specifically point to you are so wonderful. You just answered my first 6 questions in that one answer.
I warned you in advance. I said I know long form question answers. So
I'm the same way. So I love this. But I want to talk more about the voices in your book, because a hallmark of a Beatriz Williams book is that I know I'm going to get the best female characters ever. And I just want to say thank you, because I never feel like a female character of yours is in any way reduced to a stereotype. I never feel like she is not capable and intelligent. I just always feel it's so, your female characters are so wonderful. And in this book we have these incredible characters. What How do you go about crafting these characters? I have to imagine that a lot of this comes from who you are as a woman and what you think is important to show about women. And I would love to hear a bit about your process of how you think about that and how you choose to represent women in your books, and why it's so important to you to center these dynamic female voices.
Absolutely. I personally, I am a goody two shoes, like to the extreme. And we were kind of talking about this before. Like, I'm very Generation X female. Like, I was a latchkey kid. I feel like the weight of the world is on my shoulders. I got to do everything perfectly. If I'm like any of my characters in my books, I'm probably most like tiny little thing where I feel like I can't put a foot wrong ever.
Yeah.
And that's who I am. But and it all just kind of goes back to my, I guess, storytelling philosophy and what a book should be. And that is, to understand how life is lived inside the skin of somebody else, especially if that person is completely unlike you. I think, there are kind of two different types of readers. I feel like a lot of readers read a book, they want it to be a mirror.
Yes.
They want to reflect, them. They want their own selves reflected back to them. And then other readers want a window. They want a window into another world and another life experience. I tend to think I kind of write to the second group, although, you know what, there's nothing wrong with the first one. We definitely need that affirmation every so often. And and that can be fun. And so but maybe a good book should be a little bit of both. But I am particularly interested in creating women who aren't necessarily like me. And I think especially what is so important is to understand that there are strength in women comes in so many different forms, and it is not just the badass one with the gun shooting all the guys and wow, she must be strong. It's also the quiet strength. You look at Irene and you look at Janie, they are both very strong independent women, but in two different ways. And they both experience pain and trauma in their lives, and they're reacting to it differently, but they have so much common ground. But you can see when they first interact, they're kind of bristling against each other. But to me, just trying to celebrate that strength of women, like, I'm a little disturbed by the way this whole Karen thing is going right now, because it's starting to get from, like, there's actually nothing, like, I have never demanded to see the manager of my life, even when I should have. There's not necessarily something wrong with demanding to see the manager if you're not being treated well. Obviously, if you're trying to treat someone else badly or take your own frustrations out on somebody. But I notice a lot of men on Twitter are jumping on the Karen bandwagon with a little bit too much relish. And I think that, now it's kind of making us, like, if I ask to see the manager, they're going to say I'm like a Karen, and, I get really worried about this, because I think that, like I said, there are all kinds of ways to be strong. And I think a lot of the Karens out there are the ones who, like, they run the PTA, like, our schools would be crap without the Karens out there saying, no, that's not good enough. I want better for my child. And, so I try to kind of grab those as, I think whenever we, especially that sort of unlikable woman, that's the one whose skin I want to get into. Okay, I'm a big opera fan. I was just thinking about this.
Oh, good, because I wanted to ask you about that too. We're going to talk about that.
It kind of ties into that, because I'm listening to Aida, and obviously I love, the whole, but to me, the most fascinating character is Amneris.
Amneris, yeah.
Amneris, and especially she does these bad things, but at the end, her remorse is just staggering. She says, desperate, tremendous. My grief is desperate and tremendous. She says it in Italian, which sounds much better. But she's torn apart, and at the end, the last voice we hear is Amneris praying for peace. Pace, pace, mio Dio, pace. and that's just so powerful. I think that journey to me is so much more fascinating than like my journey of just trying to be good all the time, which is fairly boring.
Well, I mean, I get it. Like hopefully, we do, reading, and again, art helps us live different lives, right? And embody different characteristics and embody different personalities, and sort of try on these personalities and see how we would react versus how somebody else would react. And it's so intriguing to me when somebody acts differently than you would. That's like when your interest is engaged. And I love that you're not afraid to put women in complex is the word. It's not necessarily unlikable, but there's such a, so often things are reduced to you are good and simple, or you are bad and complex. And the truth is that it's both.
It's such a spectrum, and my father, and who, and it's funny because I never kind of realized this as I get older. My father was a pilot, which I didn't even know about.
Oh, wow.
Well, he's British. And so he didn't really talk about it because there was this great disappointment. He was a member of the, he loved to fly. He was a member of he went to University at Leeds, and he was a member of the University Air Squadron, which is kind of like the RAF training thing for university, men, obviously back then.
Right.
And apparently he was like the star pilot in the squadron, and he had all these trophies, which I didn't even notice. I thought they were just like for pub darts or something. And then after graduation, the RAF flew him out to Singapore to start his advanced training, and that's when they figured out he was actually colorblind, red and green. And his instructor just passed him through despite this. He thinks it's because his instructor actually had a crush on him. It's a whole different interesting story, but
that's amazing.
I know that's a story right there. But he was just so like his dream was crushed, and so he never talked about it. I never learned until I was in college. But so he's and he just influenced what I read and thought and did just all through, and he reads all my books, and he loves the women characters. But what he was saying is that, and I was sort of thinking about this with regards to what we were just talking about, is like, that this book, all my books, they're intensely moral. There's like a very moral core, and there's a very moral structure to them. And this book in particular, and it's all about characters being placed in incredibly complex moral situations and having to navigate their way through them, because life is not like a Twitter war. It's not black and white. It's not like you're right and I'm wrong and the other way. It's so complex, and how we navigate through situations where there's no perfect choice. There are two imperfect choices, and you have to figure out which one is the right one. And that's
what we all need right now, because we're all living through a world of terrible choices. We're living through a world
for making the wrong choice sometimes, because we all do that. We all make the wrong choice over and over again, because we're human beings, and to forgive each other for those mistakes is, I think, the most important thing we can do as human beings.
Oh, I just love that so much. I want to talk a little more about opera, because, I know your background growing up in Seattle, you were so exposed to opera and theater and performing arts, and that heavily influenced you. And your writing itself is so cinematic. When I read one of your books, I do feel like I'm watching the movie of your book. I really do. I can see, it's so sensory clear to me, and I always have a picture of what I think the character looks like, and what the house looks like, and what the island in this case looks like. I see it through your eyes, and I'm wondering how that performing arts experience translates into writing on the page, and this how you think about things, because you seem to think like a film director. And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about
it. I think I do, and it's something I sort of realized after a few books, that I very rarely describe what happens to a character in a way that is not inside a scene. I always try to be in a scene. So even if I'm describing, some sort of connecting passages, connecting parts in a life, the person is either communicating in dialogue, either with somebody else or with the reader. It's not this sort of exposition. I don't actually spend a lot of time describing things and describing people. It's just a sentence, maybe two sentences if I think it's very, very important. I do not spend a lot of time on physical description. I try to do just enough that the reader's imagination can then take over and fill in all those details, because I do feel that what is important is the story.
Yes.
And so, what all you have to do is just to sort of have a few stage directions to describe what is there, but to do it as perfectly and eloquently as you can, so that you give the reader enough to get that imagination going. So I always
and
try
then you lean into your dialogue. Like, your dialogue is exceptional. One thing that I always notice in your books is the dialogue, and specifically the female dialogue. I have to point to, it's always the wittiest, most beautiful thing. So that comes through that, like, if you don't do the description, you lean into letting
and I just think it's partly because I was exposed to a lot of music as a child, so having that I think ear is so important, to really just listen to the cadence of language is just so important. But again, dialogue, if you're watching a play or you're watching an opera where it's not even like a film where the camera is doing all this work in terms of description, and you can have long periods without any actual dialogue, in a play or in an opera, if there's not like, if the character is not talking, things are not really happening. And so I do try to sort of do as much as I can with that, to be in a scene and to think of it like a scene. And it's something I do very instinctively. I think it's not something I even, I think from the age of 5. So there's this great, if you will have heard of it if you're on the West Coast, the Ashland Shakespeare Festival, which is in Oregon, Southern Oregon. And that was our family vacation every year. And it's this like replica Elizabethan theater, in the middle of just like just like the foothills of the Siskiyous, there's nothing else really there. And it's just the most amazing setting. And I was 5 years old. And I remember I went to the Tempest and Taming of the Shrew. My mother like prepped us. She told us the stories, and we were right in the front. So we were getting like, the spit from the actors, and we understood what was going on. And just, it's, so having that early printing on my brain, I think, was just incredibly, just in terms of the storytelling, was just so important, because that's how I tell that story. And just, consciously, just having that arc just in your head and knowing what the pacing and the rhythms are going to be is just, that's something that's very hard to teach and very hard to learn. You have to
it's the feel.
You
sort of absorb the feel, and I come from the world of originally dance, then theater, then music for a long time, and I've like done it forever. And the feel is the thing. No matter how how technical you are, the feel matters. But again, going back to what you said, something you said earlier, which is also something I noticed, and anyone who reads your bio can see this, that you do have this right brain, left brain sort of equality thing, which is really interesting, where you have this structure and organization, but you also have this very emotional feel and touch, and this very like this really sort of organic quality to your writing that feels very natural. And obviously you started out in, you're an incredibly well-educated and smart woman. I mean, Stanford and Columbia, you have an MBA, you worked as a consultant in communications and strategy. And, clearly you were in the business world prior to writing. Do you think that your experience working in that world also plays a role in how you approach crafting a book? And then I have a secondary question on that.
I may end up answering it. And so it's funny, I obviously get the question a lot because my bio just practically begs that question, But the real question is kind of the other way around. Like, if all I ever wanted to do in my life was write, how did I end up in finance? And why was I pursuing this Wall Street career to begin with? Well, the reason is just, again, kind of going back to, if you can't do it perfectly, don't try it at all, because perfection is the only,
I feel like we were raised in the same way. Perfection or nothing.
For a glass of wine and like get it all out. But so and writing is, first of all, I've gotten the most amazing feedback from this book, which has really helped to kind of get through all this challenge right now. But somebody just sent me a 4-word email. It said, "Christ, this is perfect," and with the subject line, "Her last flight," and I was like, thank you. And then I was like, but it's not real, like the book is never perfect. And I think that's just something you kind of have to face as a writer, that it never is going to be perfect. You're never going to get everything exactly the way you want. And also typos. There's always going to be, and you're going to get 50 readers a day telling you, oh, did you know that on page 62, she was smoking a cigarette and yet she lights another one, and or something like that. It's,
like, I don't actually make the book. Like, you do know I am not the person printing the book.
Congratulations to those tenacious typos that make it through all those
people love to
rounds of editing and still stay there, and like 50 people will look at the book and they won't see. Wait, what was the original question? I told you
we were talking about your background, and I'm gonna
background.
You already kind of answered it, but I'm gonna switch and ask you. I'm gonna ask you in addition to that question, which is, was there a moment when, because you were working this job, you self-described in many articles, were kind of writing things and putting them in drawers and like scrubbing your computer before you turn your work computer before you turn it back in, and was there a moment when you were like, what, I'm just gonna write the book, like I'm done?
It happened after I obviously, my heart was never in my job. I did my job and I was, I did it to the best of my ability. But at that point I was, so I got married and we ended up in London. He was transferred to London, and then I got pregnant with my first child, and I was like, perfect excuse, I'll take maternity leave. And luckily he was doing well enough that I didn't need to return to work. And then before I knew it, I blinked and we had 3 kids, and that was when I think my third was a year old. I was like, I can give myself permission to do this now, because even if I crash and burn, even if I'm like that character, like the American Idol contestant whose parents have always told him he's a great singer, and he does an audition, and you're like, wow, your parents must really love you. I was afraid I was that person, that I didn't actually have the talent that I hoped that I didn't. I've been nurturing for so long. But once you have children who need you and depend on you and love you, no matter how bad a writer you might be, suddenly I had the freedom to go and do this, because I still had a very vital, important job, that was there. It was, being a mother to my kids. Yeah. So that kind of gave me the confidence I needed to go out there. And, luckily my first 2 children were born in London. So I had them on the routine. They had a 2-hour nap in the middle of the day. They went down at 7 at night and woke up at 7 in the morning, and it was perfect. So that was when I was able to have my writing time. And, I was able to go to a couple, like 1 or 2 conferences where I just like crammed in a bunch of workshops and just really started looking at this from a much more, so, okay, yes, you can write nice sentences. That's wonderful. What about storytelling? What makes a compelling story? How do you tell it in a compelling way? All those things, that kind of the craft. I was like on a crash course in that, and finally ended up with a manuscript that could sell. So, it really was it was more like I was kind of coming home to what I really wanted to do. But, having that business career, I do look at this in a professional way. Everyone's like, well, how can you write so many books? What about the muse? And I'm like, look, and my husband is, his Wall Street days are like long behind him, and I am supporting the family with my writing. And I have to write, or we don't eat. So I do write, and I try to approach it from a professional way. Look, this is a deadline. It's more like, I feel more like an artisan than an artist. Like I love that. I make this, hopefully this cheese to the very best of my ability, but I still have to get the cheese, finished and out the door, or, and it's not so much this mystical process of finding the muse. It's sitting down in your chair and getting the words going, even if you're going to have, like I rewrote the first part of this book like a million times until I finally got it right. But I kept going. I kept working at it till I got it right. And that's kind of how I look at it, is that you just keep working. You don't, you just, and you have to shut out a lot of voices in this business, creative business. Yes. people have a lot of opinions that they're not afraid to tell you, and you have to shut that out and focus on what you want the story to be and the way you want it told. And you have to just keep writing.
Oh my gosh, this is like music to my ears. You are like your philosophy. I'm so on board with it, and it's again the same.
Nothing's hard work. You got to work hard, and you can't just be like, oh, writing. It is work, and you have to look at it. You have to consider it. It is your job, and you can't just look at it as a hobby. You really have to think of it as a job,
which is increasingly difficult to do right now, which of course we were talking about a bit before, and I'm going to bring it up because it is an important point to say, like right now, that it is a struggle to be a woman in any industry, particularly a breadwinner, particularly somebody who requires time and space and, separation and isolation probably in order to write, or at least, a little bit less of the, the noise of your personal life. And how is your writing going during this time? I hesitate to ask it like that
in the virtual green room beforehand. It's funny. I used to always get this question. I obviously still do. Well, how do you juggle being a mom of four with the writing? And I used to and for a while it was very fashionable to say, well, you wouldn't ask a male author that question, would you? But I think if we're all honest with ourselves, that it is what it is, right? I don't think I want to be less than the hands-on mom that I am. But my answer to that question was always, well, there's this lovely thing called the school bus, and my children go off and get educated and socialized and all that important stuff. And then while they're doing that important stuff, I do my important stuff. And then we get together and we make dinner and have a lovely evening together. And of course, now since, March 13th, I can tell you, because that was the day we brought my son home from college. He's was a freshman. He'll be starting his sophomore year. I have been running a full service 24/7 B&B, in which you also have to meet all the emotional needs of your guests, as well as their physical needs and their laundry needs, their need for food, their need for, puzzles in the evening, movie nights, to keep morale up.
You got to keep morale up. You're also running an army.
Everything. Oh, and I got, like a dog and 3 cats. So, and you know how it is lockdown. Like even my teenage boy, who's like 15, was like, we're like, let's go for a walk. And he's like, on it, he was so excited just to go out for a walk. He was so happy to get out of the house. So you can imagine and so focusing on writing was impossible. We were talking about like, these academic journals have reported that like submissions by men have skyrocketed since lockdown, and submissions by women have plummeted. And and this is obviously, we're speaking in general terms. This is not true for every couple, for every, for every partnership is different, and with kids and so on. But I think in large, and certainly anecdotally, my group of female friends, we're bearing the brunt of it. Yeah. That's just the way it is. And we were, it's not really a problem with the solution. I mean, it's not even like you can't re-socialize. You can't reprogram brains. My husband walks down, so he just doesn't see the mess. Right. Whereas I can't not see the mess.
You can't not see it. You can't not fix it.
Tidy that thing up.
Because you're perfectionist still, like I am. Like I can't leave it.
I know. And if my kids need to be fed, I'm not going to keep writing. I'm going to stop and make sure everyone else's needs are met before I do my own thing. And I don't know whether that's socialization. I don't know whether that's, just in my X chromosomes. I don't know what it comes from, but it's there, and I can't, you know what I mean? I think, most of it, you can't just switch it off. You can't just say, okay, we're going to do things differently. We're going to get a chore schedule, blah, blah, blah. It's, I think, what do they call it? What is the mental load,
the emotional and mental load.
Things. And I don't know how you solve it. I did get I have, with a book every year, I have a manuscript that's usually due right before, the new release. And I was, I told my editor, look, this is just not going to be on time. I just can't meet this deadline right now. Yeah. And she has 2 small children at home. So she's like, totally fine. I totally get it. Just get it to me in time that we can still produce the book in time for next summer. So I did turn that manuscript in 2 weeks ago, right after this book came out, which advice to writers: don't be finishing one manuscript the same week that you're trying to promote another book. You will go insane. But I did not completely go insane. I'm trying to, kind of work off the insanity now. But but I did, and it was just hard work. It was me, as soon as my youngest was in bed, sat down for another 2 hours on the computer, and that was just life. You just have to keep doing it, and you have to work, and it's just, it's just that discipline. We're only given this one, not to start, sound like a soap opera, we're only given this one life to live, right? And you have to find balance, but you also have to understand there's times in your life when you're just going to be working hard, right? And you have to accept that and not cry about it.
And these are insane circumstances. These are not all circumstances. And this is something that we're all bearing together. And it helps to, I think it does help, I certainly want your writing to keep going well. It does help those of us, to see a writer like you, an author like you, who, is so prolific, who does produce, to also just say, yeah, this is hard, and it's okay. Like
we're
is
all
hard.
Struggling. Yes, not even even writer. We're all struggling. And again, that goes back to what I was saying, but it's about forgiveness.
Yeah.
Forgiving each other, and for understanding. I think that what I've been trying to give myself a week of pleasure reading, and I give myself permission to do this, to sit and read. I'm like, this is part of my job. I need to read. So one book I always wanted to read, everyone always raved about it, and I'd never gotten around to reading it, was I Capture the Castle. So I started that one. And there's a wonderful thing, like the best cure for depression is to be kind to people and take a hot bath. But that is so true, because our instinct when we're feeling bad is to be snappy and mean. And heaven knows my children will tell you they're ready to actually boot me out every so often, because I'll be like snapping. But it's when you are kind. It's amazing how just being kind, like 2 times running, unasked for kindness without any return expected, you actually do feel better.
You do. It really does help.
Fake it till you make it. Like fake kindness until you feel kindness. And and that kind of works when I have the strength to be kind, because it takes strength to be kind when you want to be the opposite. It is the hardest thing in the world to be nice when you want to be snappy. There's actually a scene in Her Last Flight when they're at the vet, and this comes. I love. I know. I'm not going to give away any spoilers with the vet, but they come in, and the cat needs to see the vet, and they get shown in before this guy with a beagle who just has an upset tummy. My daughter was like, looks at our beagle. She's like, oh, inspired by true events. Our beagle's a hypochondriac. She's like,
does she get
like cries? So anyway, so this beagle, and the owner is like really huffy. He's like, how come that cat got to go in before me? And Janie could react and snap at him and be like, because our cat is sicker than your dog. Instead, she goes and says, oh, sweet dog, what is wrong? What is wrong with this poor dog? And the guy softens and opens up, and all of a sudden, and then there's sort of an act of kindness that gets returned. So I'm gonna cry later on.
Oh, I love that.
I know. So anyway, so but that, I was just like, and to me that was such a reveal for I thought she was going to turn on and snap at this guy, but because she herself has suffered so much, she is able to have that empathy for him. And I loved that about her. Again, I don't know one of the reasons why sometimes these twists come along is because I learned something about my character as I go along, and that's why the twist happens, because I understand
that empathetic side of us. I mean, I'm a cat. I have a cat myself, and I know you have your beagle, and you have cats as well, right?
We have 3 rescue cats. Yes,
I love that. That sounds like my dream house.
I know. We got another cat 2 years ago, and there was a really cute other cat, and I was like, we cannot have 4 cats, because I think you cross from 3 to 4, and you cross into cat lady territory, and I'm just not ready to be a cat lady yet. Maybe in a few more years when the kids are all gone. Not ready to be a cat lady yet. So 3 is our limit. I will just give an extra donation to the shelter.
I love that. And you're all, let's you're all living in this beautiful house of yours that was just featured in the New York Times in a wonderful.
Not our house. I hasten to add.
I know it's a rental
place for 5 years, and it was supposed to just be for like a few months until we found a place of our own. But it started to feel so much like home that we couldn't. So we're pretending it's ours and just pretending, you know, pretending it's like a mortgage payment instead of a rent check, and you know,
which is great. I mean, like, hey, the thing is, are you happy living where you're living? And clearly you are.
Yes.
And it's a beautiful historic property. I encourage everybody to go check out this article and see the photos because it's absolutely stunning.
You can find out my decorating tips.
Your decorating tips, which I like, which I love. Like, look at the bookshelves. Like, come on, guys. Like, that's like the book.
This is why we walked into this room, and the whole all four walls are like what's behind me. I'm not going to show you them because they're way messier than this one. But we walked in, and we're like, oh my God, finally there's a house for rent with enough bookshelf space. Of course, now there's not enough bookshelf space because we got more books, but you know, at least we have bookshelf space for a lot of the books. So, so yeah, this is a very special room.
Well, it's so homey and so cozy. And as I said, you know, historic, clearly the connection to the past. You write historical fiction.
Yes.
There is, and you know, you clearly have a very deep connection with history and this sense of history kind of informing our lives and, you know, coming back. What is it about writing? And specifically, you tend to write in the recent past. You know, you tend to focus on 1900, you know, basically to 1970 with some exceptions, but you know, that's like sort of your sweet spot of that. Like, what is it about that time period that so captivates you, and more broadly, like the past as a whole? Like, what?
Well, you know, all of history captivates me. And the reason I focused on this particular period is not because, I mean, actually, I was not that interested in more recent history growing up. My father's British. We were very much, you know, that whole sort of like that 19th century, you know, romantic, capital R, you know,
Victorian and
exactly, and Brontes and all that. That was kind of my era. And obviously I love the Tudors as well. All these sort of, you know, great moments in British history, because that was sort of what I was raised on. And it was when I was in college, and I took a class on turn of the century Europe. So, you know, sort of that period between like 1900 and the onset of the First World War. And suddenly my perspective completely changed, because what that is about is sort of, how did we get to be where we are today?
Yes.
How did this transition come about from that, again, capital R romanticism of the 19th century to the modernism that, you know, became the dominant cultural construct in the 1920s and into the 30s, and then, you know, postmodernism and so on. But how do we get from being romantics to cynics is what I wanted to know. And it was you know, the easy answer is, World War I. But in fact, all of this was bubbling up in the years before the First World War. I mean, if you look at art, you had Picasso, you had Einstein in science, you had all these innovations going on, both on the artistic side and on the scientific and technological side. And all this is bubbling up, right? And then comes the First World War, which is this devastating event, certainly for Western civilization. And it really sort of turned that modernism from being sort of so this alternative artistic sort of thing to being the, you know, the dominant way that people looked at the world, with that sort of cynicism and disillusionment that the war had brought about. And that fascinated me. And every single decade in that journey fascinates me. I love how in the 1920s and 30s and into the 40s, women suddenly took such a much greater role in the public life of the culture, which was certainly a positive that came out. It was an adventurous time to be a woman. You could finally go out and do those things if you wanted to. You had to fight. It wasn't easy, but you could do it. Like the culture had finally given you permission to do it. And so many women did. So there's that aspect. There is the way technology transformed our lives. You know, the ability to go anywhere you wanted, which aviation is such a major part of. So all of these things, just like, wow, the speed and the the sort of the dramatic way in which our culture transformed in those decades is absolutely fascinating to me, because not just that it's, you know, fascinating on its own, but that it creates so many great points at which a great story can be told. Because, you know, a good storytelling is about friction, it's about conflict, and we are still, you know, I mean, you could argue that our nature as human beings is to be more romantic and to have that idealism, and it kind of clashes with this cynicism and this sort of the mechanical and technological world that we sort of inherited after the war. So I love those points of conflict, and that's sort of what's been the fertile ground for my fiction. On the other hand, you know, at some point, I'm certainly seeing a point at which, you know, I don't want to repeat myself. I don't want to just keep telling the same story over and over again. The book that I'm just turned in is set sort of Cold War, early Cold War espionage. But I, you know, after that, I'm like, gosh, I almost feel like I need to do something different, and I'm not sure what different is. And I think right now I just need to do a whole bunch of reading over the summer, and just to kind of refill that well and get some new thoughts bubbling up, because you know, it's as much as I have loved writing in this period, there's certainly there's a lot more books written about it now than there were when I first started out. You know, and so many other stories being told. So maybe I need to find a new, you know, a new era to.
You know what? Why not? I mean, I'm sure that you would tackle it wonderfully, because I mean, your research is always impeccable. You know, the way you embody the era in terms of, you know, and I say the era, but I mean the specific world of whichever novel
specific era it's in. Well, that's, you know, I think the phrase that I sort of bandy about with my fellow history-minded people is to be a history native. And I think you can tell when you're reading historical fiction whether this person's like, oh, I love the Nightingale, so I'm going to write about World War II, without really understanding how people thought. I mean, you get these very modern characters walking around in 1940, which is just not who people were. And you can tell if somebody is not a history native, somebody who automatically, you know, until sort of proven otherwise, sort of automatically sort of imposes a, you know, year 2000 viewpoint on, you know, on a period of history. And now there's a creative way to do that to make it more accessible to people. But, you know, I think, you know, when it springs just out of a lack of understanding about who people were and what they thought, and just the whole, you know, the bag of influences that somebody who is 25 years old in 1940 would have going in, you know, somebody who's born in 1915, what would their life have been like? What would they have experienced? How would that be different from what you experienced growing up in the, you know, 70s, 80s, 90s, you know, in the United States, for example. So being a history native is so important. It's just somebody, you just read so many history books that you just get people in the past, and you just instinctively have a feel for a particular period.
I love that. And this is a sort of related question from the audience, which feel free. We're almost at the end of our time here. I am going to ask you a couple more questions, just because I'm so loving this conversation. I hope that that's okay.
Absolutely.
Just a minute or two over. But from our viewers, from Anissa, she asks, while researching a book, have you ever stumbled upon ideas for future books? Like, do your
all the I mean, like, the rabbit holes are such, and they're useful, because they give, you know, it's all the little things that you don't include in the book that kind of give it that richer feel, because there's just this sense of such a larger world that you're just seeing a piece of. But that is my major way of finding ideas for new books, you know, and I can't even remember what rabbit hole I was down when I sort of got the idea for the book that I just finished that'll be out next summer. But, you know, it's just, you just hear a little something and you're like, oh, that's fascinating. I want to read more about that. And suddenly, you know, before you know it, you know, you have this great idea. And then the challenge is to refocus yourself on the book that you're actually supposed to be writing. You know, it's always a, but yes, all the time. And that is really what I love, because you do feel a sense of panic. You're like, oh my gosh, do I have an idea ready for my next book yet? Yes. And it's nice to have like that whole like lineup, like a baseball dugout of like, okay, here are my ideas, and which is the one that's like ready to come up, you know.
Keep a document. I keep a document. I have like a document of
all in my head, which, you know, is probably not wise at this point in my life. I probably should be writing more stuff down. I can't necessarily rely on the card catalog that is it is no longer like, you know, a high tech, you know, Google search. It's like definitely the card catalogs.
Well, the stellar ideas will always stick around. I believe that. Like, I believe that they'll come to you. And you know, can you tell us a little bit more about the new book?
Yes, I'm happy to, because, you know, yes, you know, and I when I finished her absolutely, everyone's like, well, what's your favorite book? I'm like, well, it's always the one I just finished, but particularly this one, I'm just so in love with this book. It was actually very hard for me to get going on another book, because I just love this book so passionately. But, you know, I had a deadline and I needed to come up with some ideas. And I had wanted for a long time to explore the Cold War. I think that is something that is very male dominated. We have John le Carré, we have Ian Fleming, we have a whole bunch of guys writing about the Cold War. We don't have a lot of perspective on women. Sometimes they throw in like the badass woman spy, you know, just be like, see, it's a woman character, but she's really not really acting so much like a woman. So she's a kind of male fantasy female character. But so I thought, you know, well, what about these other? So one of the things that has always fascinating, or certainly more recently, is the story of the Cambridge spy ring, which is not something we know a lot about here in the US, because this was like a British spy problem. But back in the 1930s, when capitalism was at what you might call a bit of a low ebb, you know, we were in the Great Depression, there was this widespread sense that capitalism had failed, that Marx had it right all along, and capitalism was falling and crumbling. And so I use this word with you know conscious intent. The privileged white young men of Cambridge and Oxford were very attracted to communism. And the Soviets very cleverly said, we will recruit these young men at university as agents, intelligence agents, and then as they graduate and go off and forge these careers in the highest echelons of the British government, because these were privileged young men from Cambridge and Oxford, you know, we will then reap the intelligence rewards from that. And it worked like a charm. You would not believe how deeply and thoroughly they had penetrated. I mean, like, you know, I mean, McCarthy, you know, this is not to sort of say that McCarthyism, you know, which is sort of the American, you know, it was certainly a witch hunt. But there was a kernel of truth there. Okay, there's a guy, Kim Philby, who was head of Soviet counterintelligence at MI6. So he was the guy in charge of hunting down any Soviet moles in the British government and in MI6. And he himself was a Soviet. It was he in fact, he was head of MI6's US office, met weekly to have lunch with Jim Angleton, who was the head of the CIA, and they shared, you know, so he knew all the CIA's secrets. So he then turned all that over to the Soviets. And there was a guy, Donald McLean, who was very high up in the Foreign Office. He was at the US Embassy. He was on the US Atomic Energy Commission right after the war. And he worked for the British, you know, he worked for the diplomatic service during World War II. He was at Yalta. He literally, everyone's like, why is Stalin so well briefed? He seems to know negotiating positions like before, because Donald McLean was literally handing over everything that was discussed behind closed doors from the British delegation and handing it right over to the Soviets. So, and this was going, and there were 4 more of them. Sorry, 3 more of them, as possibly a 5th. But anyway, so they, you know, all this was going on, and I got really fascinated, in particular, Donald McLean, because he had a wife who was
there we go,
and who knew he was an agent from the beginning. And it was a lot cleverer than she let on, and my bell started ringing. So I've kind of created a bit of an American Donald McLean and his wife, and as in you know, sort of the true story, eventually they defect to the Soviet Union, and that is all I'm going to say about that. But she also has a sister who wants to save her from this situation. So those are the two narratives, the two different sisters. And that's kind of all I can say at this point, other than that there are some Skylers who pop up.
Yes,
yes,
they're always, I love when the Skylers come
my
in.
sisters are related to the Skylers. And at one point when the wife of the Soviet agent is in the UK, she's in he is stationed in London, and Aunt Vivian, this would have been, you know, our three Skylar sisters. Remember Vivian, her mother is also Vivian.
Yep.
That's my twin sister's aunt, and she comes over with Tiny and Vivian and Pepper as small children.
Oh yes.
Yes, so we get to see that as little kids. So that was my little, you know, that's my little, you know, Easter egg to everybody.
I love how you tuck the Easter eggs in. I love the interconnectedness of the Schuyler family and how they appear in like all of these different configurations in different parts of the family, and you know, all of that. This book sounds fabulous. It's going to be another great one.
I had, you know, and it was there's another character, again, that sort of accent character I added. I decided I needed to add a villain in. And so I added a villain character who gets a few chapters, and added a whole other dimension to the story that really kind of, I was kind of having some momentum issues. I'm like, you know, and then all of a sudden by just adding this character who is hunting down, you know, I suddenly was like, oh gosh, you know, so exactly. And she's a fascinating character anyway. So, you know, I'm very excited about this one. And, you know, and I think I think taking that whole Cold War story and, you know, the woman's perspective, the perspective of family members of Soviet agents, all that stuff, you know, so it's not so much the cloak and dagger, although there is some cloak and dagger, but it's really about the human cost of all this. And by the way, pretty much everyone in the Cambridge spy ring, they were all functioning alcoholics. Now, not that everyone in the area but they were truly dependent on Seb to just get them through this thing of like being a traitor to their own country. Because, you know, they're British, right? This is like the worst thing you could possibly do is to be a traitor. And they were completely chemically dependent and like some of them more out of control than others, you know, but that, and then the cost of the families of all this. So I just found it all super, super fascinating, and I'm very excited for it. Was the hard part in this one actually was narrowing it down. I mean, there's just so much there. How do I pare this down to, you know, a 400-page novel? That was the big challenge with this one. And there's a substantial amount of rewriting in the beginning as I tried to find my way and like focus on the one path that I should take. Yep. But we got there in the end, and then Corona came and like blew my concentration out of the water for a month, and you know, so
okay, like I'm sure it's fabulous. I mean, your books always are. Her Last Flight is amazing, you know, and this next book is going to be amazing too. I just know it. They just always keep getting better with you, and I know, like, I don't want to take up all of your time today, but I just want to encourage everyone who's watching to please go out and buy Her Last Flight, preferably if you can from an independent bookstore. Beatrice, do you have an indie bookstore or two that you'd like to give a shout out?
I have two nearby me, and so I've been going over to Bank Square Books, and I can sign books there. In fact, I'm going to be going over there in a couple of days to, you know, sign some stock and any orders that have come in. So if you want a signed, personalized copy, Bank Square Books of Mystic, Connecticut, I can sign a book for you. So you can order from them. They ship, they do all this, they wrap it and ship it. They're great. Also RJ Julia in Madison, Connecticut. Yeah, I will be heading over there to sign some stock soon. I keep meaning to do it, but it's been a little crazy, but I will be doing down there and signing some of their stock. They've also got a great mail order operation, but there are so many but one of the great things about, you know, suddenly having to pivot and do an online book tour instead of an in-person book tour is, you know, everyone can watch from any corner of the country, not just where I happen to be on book tour, and you get to know all these fabulous independent booksellers. It is just as easy to just do a quick, you know, Google, get their website up, and they will ship it as well, just as easy as, you know, the major online retailers. So why not?
Come on, guys. Bezos is getting enough. Bezos is getting enough business right now. Let's send
my son was like, his net worth has increased by $100 billion since lockdown began. I was like,
he does not need your book money. Let's support the independent bookstores. They're all shipping. They're all doing great things. You can get a signed copy. Her Last Flight
jobs.
Can
Yes.
you show us the book one last time?
Yes, here we go. Her last
Flight. There it is. Thank
Yes, it is my pride. I love this book so passionately. I've got the most amazing feedback from readers with this one, and I am just so excited for, everyone help spread. First of all, I got 2 college tuitions now. My second child is now starting college, so yes, please buy several copies. Buy one for your mom, your sister, whatever. No, I'm just kidding. Well, I'm not totally kidding, but
buy them. Buy the copies. Buy all the
but
copies.
if you do love it, help spread the word, because I think we all want to help out booksellers as well in this book business, and make sure everybody stays on their feet for when we're all up and about and able to physically go to bookstores on a regular basis again.
Yes, and we want bookstores to be able to walk into, and we want
Yes.
fabulous books to continue flowing. Beatrice, thank you so much for being here today. Thank you for talking. This was such a great conversation. I would actually keep it going for like another hour and a half.
We really could just pour some wine and just
let's just keep
right
talking.
on the cocktail hour, right?
I love it. But until then, stay safe, stay well. I hope you find time to write. I hope that the ideas keep flowing. And everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. At Beatrice Williams, Her Last Flight, thank you for being here. And we'll talk to you again soon.
Bye-bye, everyone.